On March 6, 2020, the Studies in Applied Linguistics and TESOL Journal had the great pleasure of interviewing Dr. Richard Donato, the invited speaker for the 2020 Apple Lecture Series hosted by the Applied Linguistics and TESOL program at Teachers College Columbia University. Dr. Donato is professor and chair of the Department of Instruction and Learning at the University of Pittsburgh and holds joint appointments in the departments of French and Italian, Hispanic languages and literatures, and linguistics. His research interests include early foreign language learning, sociocultural theory, classroom discourse analysis, and teacher education. His research on foreign language education earned him the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages Modern Language Journal Palm Pimsleur Award, the Northeast Conference Freeman Award, and the French Institute of Washington Award. In 2016, he won the University of Pittsburgh's Provost Award for doctoral student research mentoring. In 2019, he was awarded the Pennsylvania State Modern Language Association Frank Mullner Leadership Award. He is the co-author of the books A Tale of Two Schools, Developing Sustainable Early Language Programs, published in 2010, and Enacting the Work of Language Teaching, High Leverage Teaching Practices, published in 2017. We'd like to thank Dr. Donato for taking the time to do this interview and to share his thoughts on some crucial issues in applied linguistics and TESOL with us.
Well, thank you for being here today with us, Dr. Donato.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to begin with some questions on history in person.
Mm-hmm.
In your examination of how history in person processes influence teachers' classroom discursive practices, you note that, to your knowledge, the concept of history in person has not been applied to the social process of teacher formation. Why do you think that might be?
Well, I think, so it's a relatively new area for me. So what I'm going to be presenting this afternoon actually will be something I've been looking at for the past 3 years, because all of my work in the past has been within sociocultural theory for a very long time. I've written a lot about sociocultural theory, but in particular I've looked at microgenetic analysis. So Vygotsky talks about developmental levels, everything from phylogenesis, right, how you develop as a person, sociocultural kinds of forms of development, how cultures develop and change over time, ontogenetic development, you as an individual, what makes you you and not her, right? And this all deals with issues of history. So when I started reading, and then I work in teacher education, so that's my other life. So I train language teachers, ESL teachers, EFL teachers, foreign language teachers, teachers of additional language. And as I read that literature, one thing that I noted, which I will talk about this afternoon, is that sort of notably absent is this notion of the history of the teacher. In particular, the history of the teacher as a language learner. And then I also thought about sociocultural theory, because we say sociocultural theory, but in fact it's sociocultural historical theory. So if you really understand sociocultural theory, you have to understand the role of history, one, and two, you have to know what history means. History doesn't mean passé. It doesn't mean over and done in sociocultural theory. History can be what we just did before the taping began. Sort of microgenetic history, like what happened 2 or 3 seconds ago, and how might that have changed you in some way, developed your thinking in some way, changed the way you thought about something in some way. And a lot of sociocultural theory is microgenetic analysis. You know that. 2 people here work in contrastive conversation analysis. And if you look at sociocultural work, it's very microgenetic. It's very moment to moment. It's very emergent. So we have not really looked at seriously history from the point of view of ontogenesis. And I thought it was interesting from the point of view of a teacher, a novice teacher, a new teacher in the classroom. And what I observe when I work with new teachers, and sort of the struggles that sometimes I have with new teachers to get them to sort of link to what we're trying to get them to do. Because and I don't know if you work in this area, if you do supervision of teachers in schools, but one thing you often see is this sort of either resistance or sort of this lack of connection to what you're learning in a university class, what you're learning on site from a mentor teacher, and what the novice teacher is actually doing. So it raised the question, why? And I'm not the first to ask the question. Borg has asked the question, Landhoff has asked the question. Some people have asked the question, why is this? And so that's why I've looked specifically at discursive practices in the classroom, because they can't be scripted. You can't put it in a lesson plan. You can't memorize it. It's unpredictable. but it requires conceptual understanding of the role of discourse in language instruction. And so it's very hard to get novice teachers into a way of thinking about discourse that says what I'm saying actually is consequential to what students are learning or not learning. And that is and to me, it's all about discourse. Education is discursive. And I'm talking discourse, not just spoken discourse, but all kinds of semiotic means of mediating thinking, right? You take that out of the equation, and you don't have education anymore. It goes away. In the same way, if you take the conversation out of dinner, you have just a bunch of people sitting eating silently with each other, right? And so talk constitutes the whole process. So, a long answer. Did I answer your question?
I think so. I think you also addressed how you came to apply it to teacher formation, or would you like to say any more about that?
Well, it's a complicated theory, and complicated in the sense that I think it is meta-theoretical. I think it applies to lots of things. But it has a lot to do with sort of the enduring struggles of institutions. And by that, sometimes those struggles, well, I'll talk a little later, and also the history that a person brings who then is sort of parachuted into that institution. And how sometimes that can result in contentious practice. And contentious is really a kind of a really strong word. I mean, I don't want to say bad practice, or it can also mean debatable kinds of practices that happen. So it may have happened to you. You come into this institution, it has its own sort of enduring issues and struggles, and you bring your own personal histories into here, and it may have caused conflict along the way. You may have sensed that, right? So the present circumstances can do that. It can create conflict, and that's what's called history in person, which is kind of a double meaning, right? It's the history that's in your person, but it's also the history that's alive and in person in the situation, right? So very, very fascinating theory, right? Now, Holland and Lave apply that to really very serious social problems. Not that education isn't serious, I'm not trivializing it, but they're talking about strip searching women in Northern Ireland. They're talking about arranged marriages in India. They're talking about socialization of people in the UK and factory workers who are working in the UK and how they're socialized and sort of the harm that's done to them when this factory worker comes in. There's all kinds of issues. Read the book, you'll read about all kinds of issues. I mean, and it happens everywhere in the world. I mean, it's happening now in Malaysia between the Chinese government and the Malay indigenous government, and the Malay government wanting to oust the Chinese government. Well, there you have this enduring institutional struggle between indigenous people and their view towards immigrants versus the history of the people who have come in and how they view themselves. And it's terrible there in Malaysia. I mean, you know, there are actually places where you can't buy a house if you're not Malay. So there is this so what does it end up? A battle. It ends up in this real contentious issue. I've taken this very serious theory and applied it to education because they say you can. They say it applies to everyday goings-on around this table, in the hallways. It applies everywhere. And the more I think about it, because when I first got it, I had to really think hard about it, as you do when you encounter any new thing, right? I'm seeing more and more cases of this. Minoritized populations coming into predominantly white institutions. The kinds of contentiousness that happens there. Okay, because of the enduring struggle of the institution, who has tried to diversify and maybe not know exactly how to do that well. I see it with language program coordinators who come into predominantly language departments like you have here in Columbia that are predominantly literature and culture teaching, and all of a sudden you have a language program coordinator who's an applied linguist. The only one in the department. And the kinds of battles so that's sort of how I've come to that. Is that clear?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
So in Davin and Donato 2018,
Did you read it?
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
You suggested that applying the concept of history in person to the social process of teacher formation may help teachers become aware of how contentious practices they encountered previously as language learners influence their current teaching practices. What types of teaching practices would you label as contentious and why?
Okay, good. To contextualize this a bit, so you're training a novice teacher, right? And the novice teacher is going through the traditional, methodology course or pedagogy course. They're reading the literature. They're learning what sometimes we like to refer to as best practice or high leverage teaching practices, like in the book that I've just completed. Practices where are pretty much condoned by and supported by second language acquisition research-based kinds of practices. And then you go into the classroom and you observe what's being done. And for a myriad of reasons, and I'm not sort of localizing this within the novice teacher, you're not seeing this happening. In fact, you're seeing just the opposite happening. In the case of world language education, you're seeing, teachers translating everything they're saying after they say it. We know that if you're going to translate into the language of the majority of the students, there's no need for them to listen to the target language. Or you see them giving explanations for which they're unprepared. They don't really understand a structure they're trying well enough to really explain it, and ending up inducing confusion on part of the students. I actually, as an aside, directed a dissertation once of someone in English language arts, and he was looking at the role of explanation in English classes, and he was looking specifically at how teachers were explaining the concept of summary. Now that sounds relatively easy. Explain summary. You summarize. I'm not going to tell you. Yet he found that teachers were very incapable of really giving a clear explanation of summary. And he did a kind of an interesting methodology. He was using students using graphic organizers, mind maps, there's conceptual maps, out of Cornell, and watching how they were sort of growing the concept across several days of instruction on summary. And he was finding that students were very confused. But again, it links into discursive interactions in the classroom. Students learn what they hear, what's in the discourse, and or not. And so teachers were very much so. I would find that contentious, right? That that's kind of a contentious practice. We also can find contentiousness where students actually, and you're going to see a case of this afternoon, really want to teach in a certain way, but the institution doesn't allow it. The school doesn't allow it. The mentor teacher, the cooperating teacher says, no, that's not the culture of this classroom. You need to do it this way. And that really creates conflict, and lots of conflict for a student teacher who's the guest in the school, who needs to comply. So those are kinds of the things. Over-reliance on teaching of grammar. How do you get teachers to really sort of, and I struggle with this all the time, how do you get teachers to move away that it's not always about grammatical structures? Sometimes it's about doing tasks. Sometimes it's about meaning making. Grammar has a role, but it is not the role. And so I'm currently working in, here's a good example of contentious practice. I'm currently working in genre-based pedagogy. What I'm finding, however, is that when I'm trying to get teachers to use a genre-based approach, because I have some students doing dissertations on this, they always start with grammar. That grammar is always the impetus for teaching a genre, which is not, as you know, because you probably studied this already, because it's widely represented in ESL, in Australia, in England, in Colombia, in Brazil. You know that, writing is not about, you don't write to practice grammar. you write to organize ideas, to state a point of view, to give an opinion. And yet, very often, so that's very contentious, is that you try to have a teacher teaching a genre-based lesson, and when you see what they're trying to do, they're always starting with the point of view of, oh, this is going to be a good writing for teaching this grammatical structure. And often they're wrong. Because you don't need past tense to talk about history, right? So often they're wrong, and yet and there's some leaders in the field in content-based instruction who say this. We want students to learn past tenses, so they'll talk about history. Well, no, you can easily slip into present tense in history. Anyhow, does that answer your question? Okay.
Thank you. What role do you think language teachers' personal histories of struggle with larger socio-political issues might play in the second language classroom? Do you think these struggles can contribute to language teacher formation or multicultural learner formation, or do you think they might create unnecessary tensions in the classroom?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. Well, yeah, there are socio-political struggles that language teachers, foreign language teachers in particular, I think maybe within the ESL, those who work with language learners, English learners, may have their struggles as well. The struggles that many foreign language teachers face, especially in today, with foreign languages being not taught as widely as before, there are lots, like marginalization within the school, within the curriculum. They're considered in many cases a special. I don't think everything should be looked at equally, right? But art's looked at as a special, music's looked at as a special, foreign language is often a special. Not giving enough time. Expecting another struggle they face is schools have 2 years requirement of foreign language. You can't do anything in 2 years. So I did a lot of my work at one point, and I'm not doing it now, but at one point I've spent close to 17, 18 years looking at early language learning programs. In fact, when I came here to Teachers College, that's what I actually talked about, my research with looking at K-5, kindergarten, fifth graders learning language. And there was a time when that was really bubbling up, really, really important. Now that has all gone away. Joanna Hamadou has this interesting, in a book I read once of hers, this interesting metaphor saying that foreign languages are like dinosaurs. Is that, well, dinosaurs in the sense that once they sort of roamed the earth and ruled the earth, and then one cataclysm, they all went away. And foreign languages, often that happens in schools all of a sudden. And it happened in a school I worked in that was teaching Japanese K-5, and overnight, the program disappeared. We got a message one August saying we will no longer be offering Japanese. It just literally disappeared. The teacher left to go somewhere else, and instead of hiring another Japanese teacher, they just decided to close the program. So those are the kinds of struggles, and they are. I mean, and they are related to socio-political issues, to how people view languages other than English. I'm sure you face this as well. Get these students learning English as soon as possible. Right? I mean, the whole bilingual education history is an example of that, right? Rather than talking, and then all of a sudden we want the students to lose their home language to learn English, and then all of a sudden they get into college or graduate and they become a national resource, and we have to reteach them their language. I mean, that's kind of sort of what happens. Yeah, I think foreign language, well, in what subject area do you have to teach a unit on advocacy? In my program, Masters of Art in Teaching program, in one course they take, they actually do a unit on advocacy. Now, I've never heard of a math teacher having to advocate for math or reading, but we actually, in language education, we have to advocate for our subject area. We have to go in and say stuff like, oh yes, they're going to do better on standardized tests. Not that that's a reason to learn a foreign language, but it's the kind of reasons that from a socio-political dimension are the kinds of reasons that, boards of education listen to. Not that I believe it. But if it works, maybe that's what we need to do. Or, they get, and there is some research on that. Some research I've done that actually shows there is some meta-linguistic awareness that comes from learning a foreign language, and students do better with that. Although I think there's all other kinds of reasons to learn languages.
Okay, thank you.
So as you and Davin point out, a teacher's history in person influences how they value certain ways of talking in the classroom and resist other ways. And you argue that teachers need to become aware of their own history in person in order to gain more conscious control of their talk and interaction. How do you recommend that teachers go about exploring their own history in person?
I have something that I've been using, and I'm actually going to show it, and I'm going to show some data from students, called the History in Person essay. It's asking students, so they've had no instruction. Keep in mind that these are, as I will explain this afternoon, are TAs that are there that are sometimes former poets from South America. They want to be literature specialists. They do not see themselves as language teachers. Not at all. They don't see that even in their future. It's not in their history, and it's not in their future, right? They see themselves teaching, teaching literature, teaching. They don't see themselves as language teachers, but they need to get their stipend. They're being funded. They need to work for their paycheck. And how they work for their paycheck, as in all universities, this isn't unusual. They teach a Spanish class or two, French, and they teach lower levels, and sometimes they're, even if they don't have any lower levels, they're put in upper levels, right? So what I asked them to do is this history in person essay, and I basically asked them to think about times when they were a learner, and think about very positive times when they were learners, things that teachers did to them. And it doesn't have to be a moment in a classroom. It could be outside the classroom. It could be, the moment could be over the course of a year, or it could be a minute. I define teaching moment very broadly, right? And I have them author themselves. So what was positive about a teaching, learning experience you had, and maybe something you'd like to emulate? And then I asked them to think about what was negative and what you'd like to emulate. It is fascinating, and you'll see the data later. It is fascinating what they come up with, because very often what they come up with are very solid, spontaneously, they come up with very solid concepts that actually are scientific concepts in the field. And it gives you a basis to begin. Remember when you talked about your teacher didn't instill any confidence in you to say anything in the classroom because there was just too much error correction going on and you weren't confident? We're going to talk about that today. So this history in person essay, I think that I'm calling this, and you'll see this afternoon, I'm calling this, you have to unplug the history. You've got to kind of take it and get students to kind of go into their histories and find out what might be tacitly affecting the way you're teaching. So we know, you know about IRE and IRF, right? And this is something that you see a lot of in classrooms, right? As much as we want learners to kind of engage, novice teachers engage learners in extending utterances, right? What we see is this predominant form across all subject areas of I ask you a question, you give me a response, and then I say very good, right? And it's done, right? And it's very simple tweaking of that, a very simple change of, can you ask a follow-up question? Can you kind of take that answer and redirect to another student? How can you create a discourse community in the classroom by doing that? You'll never do that if it's IRE all the time, ever. You have a community of evaluation going on. You don't really have a discourse community because you're not creating any discourse. Why is that so hard to change? Even after you present on it, you go in and you're still seeing, molto bene, bravo, très bien, muy bien. You're still seeing all of this and a really, it's interesting too that there's only one area where it has not been seen is in the teaching of mathematics in Japan for some reason. It's really, I've read that somewhere, that the teaching of mathematics in Japan IRE tends to go out, that there's a lot more of a discursive environment going on about problem solving, which is kind of interesting, right? But and you've seen it, that this form of discourse is. But why did they do that is the question. Because that's what was done to them. I don't want to be simplistic about it, but we teach the way we were taught, not by how we're being taught to teach. But in some ways, there's a little bit of truth to that saying. And they have. So we talk about the apprenticeship. Have you studied apprenticeship of observation and the Lortie stuff? You come from thousands of hours of being implicit teaching apprentices just by observing it all the time because you participate in it. So of course that's what you're going to do, and changing it's hard. And maybe one way to change it is just to get students to kind of think about it, to think back, what was your learning like in light of sort of what we know today from research, from what we know about language acquisition. How does that compare? How does it contrast? Okay? Okay.
Well, you and Davin also state that history, both as a language learner and a teacher observer, affect novice teachers' instruction. How does a teacher educator begin to undo the harm that may have come from novice teachers' exposure to poor or misguided pedagogical practices?
I don't know. Do you know?
As a teacher educator myself, I work on it,
I
but
know,
I'd
you're
love
all-
some advice.
Well, you're all teacher educators, right? You're all
Yes.
going to be teacher educators. You're going to be facing this.
Yeah.
This is real. This
Yeah.
is the world we live in.
It is.
How do you undo
Yeah.
that? I think there may be some way. I think that the work in practice-based teacher education, and I don't know if Teachers College, you're looking into that work from Michigan, the work of Grossman and Deborah Ball, some of the people who are doing practice-based teacher education. I think one way to do it is less is more. So instead of trying to cover everything in a semester, you'll never be able to do that with a novice teacher. 2, whatever you cover should be developmentally appropriate and something that you can do so that they can be well launched as novices. So that I like that concept of an accomplished novice, not an accomplished teacher, because you'll never do that as teacher educators. I'm warning you, you won't do that. What you can do is you can get a novice to a level of certain accomplishment for certain kinds of practices. So we have a practice-based approach where I am now. We literally teach only 4 practices in 1 year over 2 semesters. 4. Now they're complex practices, like using the target language in the classroom in a way that's comprehensible to your students. In a way so that students can learn through the language, not just about the language. That is highly complex. We may spend 6 weeks on that. I spent 5 weeks with my students on teaching culture. In how do you integrate culture into a language lesson, where typically it might be a class or an hour or 2. So I think one way is do less. Focus on what you think are the developmental practices that students really need to unpack, deconstruct for them. Do not rely on reflections alone. So I know people get really upset because we talk in teacher ed about reflection, go home, write your reflective journal, blah, 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 blah. And yet somehow when we look at how other professions are formed, the formation of a doctor, the formation of a lawyer, that's not what they do. The doctor doesn't do surgery, or the intern do surgery, and then the head surgeon, she tells the intern, go home and write a reflection on what you did. That would not be a very efficient way of teaching an intern how to do open heart surgery. The efficient way is to stop you if you're not doing it correctly. So I really am very much, there's been some controversy about practice-based teacher education. Some people think it doesn't address social justice issues. I don't agree with that. I think it does. But I think that that's one way to undo some of the harm that's been done to them, is to do less, deconstruct more, make explicit what the pedagogical moves are, make explicit the goals of what the teacher's doing, stop all the observation. The observation is just, it doesn't do much actually, because Vygotsky says, to really imitate truly, you need to understand the goal of what somebody's doing. I can imitate you writing right now. I don't know the goal of what you're writing, and so my imitation of your writing would probably not look anything like it, but we expect imitation all the time. You demonstrate, now you do, what they do doesn't look like what you demonstrate. Why is that? Where did you see me give a worksheet? I didn't give a worksheet. Why are you giving worksheets? Why is this? Well, because they don't understand the goal behind what you did. So I think one way to do it is to make explicit a limited number of fundamental teaching practices that are versatile, that can be used across different levels, that can be used in different languages, to deconstruct them, not just model them. You're going to model. Everybody models something, but you can't stop there, because make clear what the goals are. Take a look at all the moves. A novice teacher looks at an accomplished teacher in the classroom, and that accomplished teacher is doing stuff intuitively. There's this tacit teacher knowledge that this teacher can't make explicit, and then the student gets up and can't really imitate at all. So I think that's one way to do that is less is more, developmentally appropriate, develop an accomplished novice, make explicit the goals of what's going on, what are the pedagogical moves, and how might that compare to what you've experienced. What you might find is the student will say, wow, I wish I was taught that way. That's what I hear. Why did my teacher not teach me that way? And then they begin to embrace some of those new practices.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
So we have one last question related to history in person.
Mm-hmm.
So your recent research aims to explore the relationship between teachers' personal histories and classroom discursive practices as a step toward transformative teacher education. What are some of the challenges you have encountered in pursuing this agenda, and how have you addressed them? And then as an additional question, moving forward, what would be some of the top priorities for us to focus on in this endeavor?
Well, this sort of follows up on what we just talked about. That's right. So some of the challenges, I think, are finding out what are the developmentally, for us, for our field. So practice-based teacher education, and I'm not here to sort of say that's the be-all and end-all, has been widely researched in mathematics education, reading, English language arts, social studies. Language education has not been at the table. There's a JTE article that just came out a few months ago that actually shows everything that's been done in practice, and it's really interesting. We are noticeably absent from the discussion. So I think one of the challenges is for us to sort of get on board with understanding, so what are the practices that our teachers really need to know, and what can we realistically do in the time we have to really launch novices in an effective way into the classroom so that they can assume the responsibilities of instruction in their first job, right? With some support, obviously, but so that they can be expected to assume. So I think that's a challenge. We tried, and I think we've come up with some, and then as also that how do you do this within a teacher education program where you have a limited amount of time? So I teach in a Master's of Arts in Teaching program, so in some ways I'm not faced with one methods course in the senior year in the fall and then student teaching in the spring, because I deal with interns who are in schools from the beginning of school to the very end. They're in schools 20 hours a week. By January, they assume instruction for 2 classes. They get 7 to 8 observations a semester, so they're constantly being observed. And they have laboratory kinds of experiences where they're teaching peers. And they're doing group planning of a particular practice. So, for example, we might do, well, we won't do culture, I'll talk about that, but we're dealing with, asking questions as a practice. Really complex. Lots of kinds of questions you can ask depending on the goal you have for instruction and depending on where the students are. So we might have students prepare a lesson or an episode, a segment of a lesson in which they have to ask questions. And we'll have them do group planning. Then we'll have them one person in the group present that plan to the class, critique it. Now, of course, this is after explanation and all of that. Then we have them go into the classroom and do that lesson and videotape it, and we bring it back to the laboratory class, and the supervisor comes in to watch. So the supervisor was there. So we have the supervisor, we have the methods instructor, we have the students, we have the video in the class. And so then we watch it. And the draconian part of this is we have a checklist. You have to get so many checks that you did it to pass. And if you don't, you do it again. You just do it again. So that's one way, and one of the challenges has been I think one of the challenges to like an undergraduate teacher certification program is how do you do that in a limited amount of time? We're lucky. We have time to do that. Our students take Teaching and Learning 1, Teaching and Learning 2, Teaching and Learning 3, 2 practicum courses. We have time to do that in addition to everything else because they're with us for a full year. But how do you do that when you have one methods course and you're an undergrad? And many of you might be teaching in those kinds of institutions when you graduate. How do you get more practice-based where students group plan, plans are critiqued, peer teach, critique the peer teach, take it to the classroom, try it in the classroom. And then how do you take a practice that you've sort of taken out of the total flow of instruction and put it into an instructional activity so that the student, and I don't know if I'm being clear on this because this is what I'm actually working on now, because you just can't say, go in and ask questions. Like, right, so you've asked questions here, but it's been within an instructional kind of context, right? I knew that there was an interview, I knew it was going to be videotaped, I knew this for the graduate students, we had a little preliminary, so it was contextualized practice. So how would you, let's say that using the language comprehensively is something you want to work on, or asking questions. You know, how do you ask a question, or how do you teach a reading lesson? How do you assess comprehension of a text that gets beyond WH questions and into interpretation of text, right? So I think that, how do you take that little piece and place it into a larger context so that the student teacher can really focus on that during the course of instruction? I don't know if I'm being clear on that.
Yeah.
I mean, it has to always be done within some larger context, right? So that the practice success has meaning. So now I'm teaching you how to ask a question, but now those questions have meaning because they're placed in a larger context. Oh, we're discussing a historical document, or we're talking about the story, or I'm showing you a text and I want you to focus on a grammatical structure in the text, and I'm going to ask you questions about it in a certain way and in a certain sequence. Okay? All right.
In Kutschall's article on integrating culture into language classrooms, she argues that long gone are the days when anyone would suggest that language could be taught on its own as discrete grammar points with no sense of the cultural products, practices, and perspectives of native teachers. Do you think this statement accurately reflects the state of language teaching practices worldwide? Why or why not?
No, it doesn't. I think she's right, because I've quoted her, but I don't think that that's exactly what's happening. This also kind of connects to what I said earlier about being very grammar-driven in our approach. We still are sort of reifying this whole notion of grammar as that is what we're all about. And you can talk about language functions, and you can talk about interactions, and you can talk about collaborative learning, and you can talk about all kinds of things. But in the end, I think teachers still, language teachers, at least the ones I deal with, are still very much rooted in the back of their minds in today I'm teaching ER verbs in French. I think that's the fact. So I don't think, but I think she's right. I think you really can't teach language, and you know this because you're in teacher education and in SLA and applied linguistics, you can't teach language by giving a repertoire or smorgasbord of grammatical points. I mean, Joan Kelly Hall talks about interactional competence, right? That's a whole form. I mean, it's not about just grammatical competence or sociolinguistic competence, but there is this interactional competence. I mean, we know this about a lot of language learners. They have a lot of language, but when the exchange student comes over, they have nothing to say, right? This is so common. And so the question becomes, well, what? Well, they don't have that interactive competence, because they haven't really learned language in a way that has engaged them in interactions, or to teach them how to work in interactions, how to negotiate interactions, how to ask questions in interaction, how to bond with somebody who doesn't speak your language. So I think that's, I think we're really far from getting to what she's saying, but I think, yes, gone are the days, at least from our perspective, from SLA research, of teaching language through grammar alone. I mean, we know that it takes a lot more to do that, and if we want to be successful. And I don't think we're there yet. And I think given the fact, too, that within foreign languages, they're being taken out of the curriculum now, it's really kind of a sad situation. I mean, we had a time where we were sort of proliferating language within the schools, and now it's just the opposite. It's within the foreign language. And I don't know in the ESL, in the English learner community, but I mean, I don't know what it's like there, but I think still it's probably pretty much get them English speaking so that they can be mainstreamed into the English classroom, and not create bilingual speakers. It's interesting. So Kristen's working with this thing called Seal of Biliteracy. Do you know what that is? All right, so in foreign, it's called the Seal of Biliteracy. So ACTFL, the American Council on Teaching of Foreign Language, has started this Seal of Biliteracy, which means that if you graduate and are intermediate mid on speaking, reading, writing, listening, so that's not the ACTFL OPI, I think they do that on the Apple test. There's a test that looks at, you will be given a Seal of Biliteracy. I forget how many states have adopted this. You go to the university, and universities decide with the seal about what you get. Some give credit, some give placement, but it's a credential. And if you're a heritage language learner, you can get the seal of biliteracy, right? What she's actually finding is heritage language learners who are getting the seal of biliteracy, it's an identity issue. They actually start saying, oh my goodness, I'm bilingual, I didn't know that. They actually are unaware of the fact that they can live life in two languages. Isn't this fascinating? I just thought this was, I thought it was fascinating. And it's the seal of biliteracy that sort of like endorses them as a bilingual speaker. It's really a cool thing, right?
Yeah.
Really neat. But I think that, I think that's what we need to be doing. I don't think teachers are developing what I like to say now, multilingual identities. I think that's what teachers need to do. They need to be developing in students multilingual identities. That's not grammar generators. They need to be developing them as, guess what? At every level, you're a multilingual, you're a bilingual or multilingual speaker. At every level, I don't care how basic you are. You can do these things, but it means teaching language in a certain way to do that.
So Kutschel also explains that when language teachers teach culture, they tend to focus more on the products and the practices of the target language culture, and less so on the perspectives.
Yeah.
So how do you recommend that language teachers integrate cultural perspectives like values or beliefs into their classrooms?
Have you all studied foreign languages when you were in high school? Yeah. So you got a lot of products and practices, right? You saw the videos, and you saw the Eiffel Tower, and you looked at little boxes of cereal in Spanish, and that kind of stuff. So, all that kind of, that's very common in foreign language classes and really rather easy to do. It's not the goal of culture instruction, however, so I'm not actually going to be talking about that today. So you've probably had language taught in cultural context, so if you were learning food, you probably learned food from some target language countries, right? That is relatively easy for teachers to do, right? You'll learn churros in Spanish, or baguette in French or something. What's really hard is to really get into the perspectives of the speakers of a language other than your own, and why certain cultural patterns exist. Because what students will typically say is, this is stupid, this is dumb, why do they do that? And they say that not just about, they say it here, people that they encounter here in New York City, right? So how do you get teachers to probe into, get students to begin to reflect on, at various levels of instruction, using the target language, certain cultural perspectives, which I think is really the goal. And so that, they can begin to understand, how do people value, how do they believe, how do they think, what are the historical roots to certain practices, cultural practices. And we're going to talk about that this afternoon. Why are things the way they are, and how there are contrastive. So there's an easy way to do it, I think, using just simple images, which I'm going to show you. It's very low tech, and it doesn't take anything. Some people are doing virtual field trips and all these sort of things. I take a very low tech approach. But that's one way to I think that's where the goal needs to be, is how can we see the relationship between a practice and a perspective, what people do and why they do it and how they think about it and what they make and why do they make it that way, and to get students to see this without developing a stereotype or a bias or a rejection of that culture, thinking that, well, it's not me, why are things the way they are? It always comes up in teaching culture. How do you teach culture without stereotyping?
Exactly.
That's a big question.
That's a big, so if you want to answer that question, that would be an interesting question to answer.
It comes up in every class I teach. Aren't you just developing a stereotype? Well, I think that, I think stereotypes are negative. I think that's the first thing. They're biases. The stereotypes are negative. And if you look at what a stereotype is, it always looks at the other on a very negative light. I don't think doing cultural perspectives do that. I think you're developing a stereotype if what you're coming up with is a very negative view of another culture because they're not you. So I think that's one way. The other thing is I do think there are some general patterns and cultural practices that are pretty much shared. But again, they may not be shared with everyone. Not every French person eats cheese, So I think that there's ways of dealing with that to make students aware that when they stereotype, they're actually casting a culture in a very negative light. And that's not what it's about. This is about understanding other people and how they value, how they believe, how they act, what they make, why they make it, and what are the historical antecedents that might produce some of that. Does that make sense? Yeah, but I know I had one year it came up in a class and I was totally unprepared for it. It was one of those unanticipated student utterances, totally unaware of it, totally unaware. And it really did floor me that this would even be something people would consider. Because actually, I think teaching culture prevents stereotyping. And if you find if stereotyping, something's not right. It should actually prevent stereotyping, and it should develop understandings.
Well, wonderful. Okay, we'll end on that then.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun talking to you.